Aloha everyone, and welcome back to Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum's webinar series, where we discover and investigate a range of topics, including aviation, aeronautic innovation, World War II, Pacific theater history, and more. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. Our museum is located in the state of Hawaii on historic Ford Island, right in the very center of the famous Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu. It is our museum's mission to steward the history of America's first aviation battlefield of World War II. Before we begin, I would like to let our viewers know we have a chat and Q&A function that is available to you. And we are excited to have you here. We love people joining us from around the world. So if you could take a moment and enter into the chat where you're viewing from, we would love to hear from you and see where you're coming from. Also, we invite you to use that chat for any questions or comments, any historical observations you might have. However, I do want everyone to be kind and respectful to each other while they're using these functions. Behind the scenes, we have two museum educators that are ready to answer any of your questions you may have historically or about our museum. Please inquire. Just to let you all know, our museum is open during this time. If you would like to come and visit us and you're on Oahu, come visit and spend the day with us. We have so many things, not just from World War II, we have post-war aircraft, all kinds of things to discover, so come on down. Today, we are joined by our wonderful moderator, General Dan Figleaf. Thank you again for joining us and being our pilot today.
Pleasure, Ashley, aloha.
Welcome, and of course, our guest speaker and who everybody is here to listen to, Dominic Bush, our PhD student, from East Carolina University. We will be getting to know you a little bit better today and a lot about your work. That's going to be very exciting for us. So thank you both for being here today. And Fig, take it away.
Thanks, Ashley. Aloha, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I'm really excited about it. I hope you are too, because our guest speaker, Dom Bush, has got a remarkable story or set of stories about being an underwater archaeologist on, as he calls them, decommissioned aircraft. Before I get into the conversation with Dom, a couple things. We do have guests from all over the world. I've seen Ecuador, Australia, a couple of folks from down under, and I did see one from sunny Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I was just there for 2 Brewers playoff games, and I'm sad that they're out. But welcome all of you from wherever you might be. The real key to this session is going to be your questions and Tom's answers and my maybe perspective on his answers. But that's really what we want to get to after we talk about Dom's remarkable work. He is a doctoral candidate, and his area of study is everything about underwater aircraft wrecks, and there's a lot more to it than I knew until we started working on this webinar. There are legal issues, there's the nature of corrosion, the discovery, the modeling, it's very cool. Dom, how did you get into this world? What led you to become an underwater archaeologist?
Thanks, Fig, for that introduction. My interest in underwater archaeology really comes from where I'm from, which is Kailua, Oahu. So I grew up 2 minutes from the beach, grew up diving, snorkeling, and just always had an interest in history. And so the World War II history and Oahu's history are very much intertwined, as everyone knows. And so that's just kind of been a personal connection for me, and it's something that I've just been drawn to. And fortunately enough, I've been given several opportunities to go work on projects.
Well, you've made the most of those opportunities. And you said, as everybody knows, but okay, maybe I didn't know how much there was to study around Oahu. And frankly, until I became affiliated with the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum, I had almost no awareness of that. the training during and after World War II, and the amount of debris it left. So there was a lot of training, and you've put together some slides to show it. A lot of training during the war, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, throughout the islands. Would you tell us about the level of that? And I'll start spoiler alert. There are over 1,400 Department of the Navy wrecks around the islands. And we can't even find out how many Air Force and Army Air Force wrecks there were. I was at the National Museum of the Air Force 2 days ago, I think. We're on a road trip. We don't even know how many of those there were. So tell us about the training that occurred that led to what you now study.
Yeah, great. So as you mentioned, there are a lot of aircraft wrecks in the water around Hawaii. Most of them are going to be training accidents. There were a few December 7th casualties, obviously. And then as you move up the chain into the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, there's a bit more wrecks up there. But Hawaii was a very important place during the World War II training. It offered these kind of ideal conditions for what they would face in the Pacific theater. And so I believe Hawaii hosted around 2 million service members between 1942 and 1945. So there was
we've got a map, if we could bring that slide up, that shows that it was the entry point into the Pacific theater.
Exactly. And so this map kind of shows the extent of the Japanese expansion in the Pacific, which of course was halted at Midway. And it shows what would become the island hopping campaign and the air ferry routes that would get planes from the mainland to Hawaii and then eventually to the Pacific theater.
And so the training that went on, it wasn't just flying training.
No. They would aviation training was undoubtedly an important part and probably the most dangerous part, but they practice everything from shore invasions to jungle warfare. The islands, the main 8 were.
Yeah, if we could go to slide 3, we'll see some of that training occurring. And by the way, it was of no small impact to the residents.
Of course, yeah. So this was shows the South Maui, and where residents were actually barred from going to their beach homes because it had been used as an amphibious training site. And so you see some of them standing behind the barbed wire while the service members are conducting training of some sort.
And you can say, well, it's World War, so they probably accepted it, but that's your home, so maybe not.
Yeah, I'm sure it was
had to be a difficult environment.
Exactly.
Okay, so we did all this training, and amongst that was a lot of flying training. And I know from my time as an Air Force pilot that even training is dangerous. It used to be a lot more dangerous. In fact, 30 years ago, slightly more than that, when I was a young F4 pilot, we had a lot of accidents. And I worked with the Army a lot. We had quite a few accidents on the ground, training accidents. It was a different environment. Yeah,
definitely. There was obviously plane wrecks, but landing craft wrecks and other ones that were costly. I think an interesting point is that during World War II, there was about almost 15,000 aviator fatalities during just training within the United States aviation.
Yeah.
And that 15,000 is actually more deaths than all of the pre-Civil War wars that America fought. So you had, the Revolutionary War, 1812, Mexican-American War, all of those combined do not equal the World War II aviator fatalities that happened just within the United States.
And in fact, if I remember correctly, and I'm pretty sure I do, more commissioned Army Air Forces aviators died during World War II, now we're talking combat, than all US Marines. Aviation was dangerous and combat aviation was really dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about World War II is 38 years after the very first aircraft that flew right here in the state that I am, North Carolina. and you go from a balsa wood plane that flies 100 feet to now you're flying these fighter aircraft, these bombers, and so it was just a radical transition in technology.
And people were shooting at you, which makes
and
everything
then you had 50
more
caliber bullets whizzing past you.
Yeah. Okay, well, so as all this training goes on, we crash a bunch of airplanes, and you started getting interested in both finding them and examining them. Tell us a little bit about the airplanes that are out there, and if we can look at slide 7, we'll see the training area. So they were all around.
Yeah, so I think,
as you said,
I think there was a total of 22 airfields that I could find. 13 of them on Oahu, but as you can see, there was other ones on Kauai, Molokai, Maui, the Big Island.
And in the next slide, I think we show the Bellows area, which is well known.
Yeah, so these were
and the location of one of the wrecks.
Yeah, so these are actually 2 of the wrecks we looked at for this research that I'm currently working on. One was off Bellows Airfield, and one was off of Naval Aviation Station Pu'unene, and that aircraft crashed in Ma'alaya Bay. And so it's just kind of showing, if there's an airfield, there's probably a good chance that there might be something in the water.
Yeah, like almost 100%. And if we go to slide 9, because the aviation was so dangerous on the ground, we had plenty of wreckage there. And we got an interesting question from Rick on Oahu, and I know who Rick is, but there was just a lot of debris post-war. And Rick's question was that debris surplus military hardware, whether it was a truck or a tank or an aircraft? Are there any dumping grounds where they chose to just push it off ships into the ocean, or as opposed to taking up room for troops and and expending the cost of sending these things back to the U.S.? What are there burial grounds, big junkyards under the ocean around here?
Yeah, that's a great question, Rick. To my knowledge, I don't know of any dumping grounds in the main 8 islands. I've heard there's rumors of some maybe further up the chain in what is the Papahanaumokuakea Sanctuary. But I do know my very first archaeological experience underwater was actually at one of these dumping grounds in Apra Harbor.
Really?
Yeah, it was an old CB site. So after the CBs came in and constructed what they needed to construct, tractors, surplus motors, all of that were tossed overboard. And this was actually a common practice throughout the Pacific, became known as Operation Magic Carpet. And it was designed, one, to get the troops home faster, but also so you don't flood the market with surplus metal, drastically lowering the prices now that wartime is over. And I think the most famous one is probably in Vanuatu in the South Pacific. It's known as $1 Million Point, because of millions of dollars worth of military surplus was dropped in the ocean over there.
Wow, I've been to Vanuatu, and sadly I didn't know that at the time. I do know that it was some of the best snorkeling I've ever done. I mean, just beautiful, and the perfect water temperature. Hey, here's a word from not our sponsor, but I love this in the chat. Edmund Arabe says, "Greetings from your SLS 2012 physics teacher. Good to see you're doing so well."
Awesome. Always good to hear from St. Louis.
Cool. Okay, so there's all this stuff dumped everywhere. 1,400 wrecks. Your study looked at 4, but my question would be, is it all finders keepers? You know, can anybody find a wreck that hasn't been located and then claim it? What's the legal side of this? Yeah, or is it sort of the Wild West legality wise?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, one that I I've seen a few times now in the questions that were submitted beforehand. And so it's a kind of a complicated legal patchwork. The two main ones you can see right here, the Sunken Military Craft Act and the Natural Historic Preservation Act. And the latter, the Sunken Military Craft Act, is really the main governing body, and it's established in part by the US Constitution, which gives ownership of property made for the federal government, that they retain right title ownership forever. That can never be revoked, except for the express written consent of Congress or of the federal agency in charge. And so to answer it specific to aircraft, the Navy does retain all titles to their aircraft, and any kind of work that has to be done on them usually has to go through a permitting process. If it's deemed a non-disturbance, if you just want to take photographs or perhaps dive on it, that may be fine. But anything that's going to leave any kind of impact, even if it's a small one, that will have to go through the permitting process that the Navy has. Army aircraft are a little bit different. Everything prior to 1961, technically the Army has abandoned title to it, but they do make the provision that if you want to do anything from archaeological work to recovery, full-scale recovery, you do have to get the permission of the landowner. And so in the United States, for the first 3 miles offshore, that's often the state, someone like the Department of Natural Resources. And then everywhere past that 3-mile mark, all the way to the limits of the US economic zone, that's going to be the federal government's ruling. And so to answer who can do what from a legal perspective, it's going to come down to which branch of the military and then where exactly is the location of it.
So I know maybe a month or 6 weeks ago in the news here on Oahu, tourists were fined for doing things they shouldn't have in the proximity of some monk seals. It's not as dark as that just sounded, but they violated the rules on leaving seals alone. Is there any record of somebody being prosecuted for or sued for, let's say, stealing a control stick out of a crashed Corsair?
Yeah, so there's been legal battles where sometimes it's kind of funny if you read the court transcripts and stuff, they actually end up treating the aircraft as like a entity. So I've seen aircraft that have been under arrest as a legal maneuver. So there has been issues where, especially between the Navy and maybe a salvaging group. I saw one in the state of Washington a while back, that the Navy does reserve the right to prosecute if you don't go through the proper permissions. For the Army aircraft, which we were talking about, recently a group tried to recover an F-82, so a little bit later after World War II.
Yeah, Twin Mustang.
Exactly.
Beautiful.
So they tried to recover an F-82 from a location in Alaska to go restore it, but they didn't get the land manager, which I believe was either the state or the Bureau of Land Management at the time, and they ended up getting prosecuted, having to pay a $50,000 fine, but they got to keep the aircraft. But so there is,
okay,
so
I bet that worked out. So Larry Steinberg is asked in the chat, folks, keep those questions coming. What about aircraft with crews still aboard? Because many of these accidents were fatal accidents. Are they considered grave sites? Which I would assume would have a different legal significance.
Yeah, absolutely. So the aspect of human remains is one of the first things people will investigate. So a lot of these aircraft, if they're known about, the issue of human remains will have been covered long before. There's of course there's government agencies whose job is out there to go recover the remains, and so that's a big part of underwater aircraft archaeology, is to go identify the plane and then search for any even the most minute signs of human remains, even down to the DNA level. And so those are generally treated with a different level of respect. And of course, anything to do with human remains takes on a completely different legal aspect.
So these aircraft all have to have been discovered. The one we're showing on the screen now, the F-4 Corsair near Oahu, is pretty well known, maybe the best known dive site, if you will, for an aircraft. But I think we've got a slide where we can talk about some of the ways you find these, you sense these aircraft. If we could bring up slide 11, I think that's it. So how do you find them if it's not a commonly known or well-known site, like as in the case of the Corsair?
Yeah, so I would say that from an archaeological perspective, the main way we can do it are through these remote sensing technologies. And I have on the screen here a sonar image, and that'll give you kind of almost like a picture of what's down there, and you'll drag a sonar behind a ship often, or if you've got the money, maybe attach it to an automated underwater vehicle that can maybe tow the sonar for you. Or you can, what me and a colleague here are doing is a magnetometer survey, which is basically you're dragging something to detect if there's any metal, and you'll see on the graph that there's a spike there, which indicates that there's some kind of metallic object. And then you can maybe send in divers or ROVs with cameras that go investigate to go see if there's an aircraft there. But often what's most effective though, and I would say, these surveys are awesome and I like to be a part of them, but the method that discovers the most is just talking and working with local divers. They know the area the best. They're often enthusiastic, I've found in my experience in Hawaii, to want to be able to contribute to the understanding, to the preservation. So a lot of the sites in Hawaii have been discovered and confirmed by local divers working with archaeologists from universities, from agencies like NOAA.
So we've got another related question also from Larry regarding a B-25 lost, and he gives the date near Buka in the British Solomon Islands. Talks about what kind of engines, and there's a lot of steel to locate. But you're saying that's kind of the end game, right? When you get to specific sensors, after you look at the military records, which may or may not have some good data, get to local knowledge, open source review of, if it was in a place or near a place where there was a newspaper published, you do all that. And then when you've got it pretty well narrowed down, that's when sensors like this come in, right?
Yeah, so the archival research, as you alluded to, is a crucial part of what we do. You can go in, and often for many of the naval aviation records especially, you can go figure out which aircrafts crashed in what locations, and then you can design a survey based off of that kind of groundwork you laid on with the archival work, and then you can bring in a survey equipment to go look at it, to go survey the area and try to locate the downed aircraft.
We've got some other questions that are a little more specific. Folks, we'll come back to that. We have time, I think. Looking at my Apple Watch, yes, we have time. But I want to make sure we get through the rest of your story, if you will. So let's look at, once you've got these wrecks identified and you get to them, you take a lot of pictures.
Yeah, that's one of the
Would
main
you
things
say
we
that's
do.
your primary evidence gathering method is photography, underwater photography?
Yeah, I would say it's especially on these shallower sites where I can I can scuba dive. I can be down there for well over an hour, which will give me enough chance to take thousands, literally thousands of photos. And so that's one of the main things we can do that helps document these wrecks is just simply take photographs.
Yeah, that's cool. But I mean, I'm on a family road trip more than 2 weeks in length, and we're going to have thousands of photos. I don't know what I'm going to do with it, but I do know what you do with it. And if we could go to slide 16, we're going to see what you all do with it. This is a remarkable 3D image, but it's not a 3D image per se. It's actually a collection of images put together to give this 3D representation. Did I describe that properly?
Yep. Yeah. And so one of the things we like to say is that you don't have to be a diver to see the aircraft, and just cool. 2D photos is nice, but they give you one perspective. And so for this image, this was a hell diver down in Maui, Ma'alaya Bay. And what we did was just canvas it with a GoPro, taking about 40 minutes of video, and then we extracted stills from that video and used a software program to essentially stitch everything together. It takes, hours to run, but then you come out with a 3D model that you can rotate and look at different perspectives. And it's nice from an outreach perspective because we can present stuff to the public, but also from like a science management perspective. We have this model, and then maybe 5, 10, 15 years from now, we can make another one, and we can actually see how has it changed? How has corrosion affected it? How have weather events such as hurricanes or strong tides, how does that maybe work? Or even like as you see the coral growth on it, you can use it to document what's living on there.
Yeah, that's amazing. So if we go back to slide 14, you start with before these aircraft were decommissioned. They look like this, and then if you see them underwater, slide 15 on the next slide, they look like that. But that's as you said, a 2D image, and you can just look at that. You can say that's cool. These next series of 5 slides are Corsair and Helldiver, or I'm sorry, Thunderbolt and Helldiver. But as you study it, you can manipulate it, you can turn it, you can look at it from different angles, like some of the things we've seen. So let's step through the next 4 images slowly. That's incredible, Tom. I mean, the detail. And
yeah,
we've got a question. Go ahead. We've got a question in the chat that says you're very interested. The viewer is very interested. It's Larry again. Larry's very interested, and we appreciate that, Larry. In the dissertation on corrosion and aircraft survivability in warm island environments, we're going to talk more about that. But this imagery really gives you an opportunity to do a detailed archaeological survey of the wreckage. There's more to it, as we'll see in a bit, but it's remarkable stuff.
Yeah, and I chose these 2 aircraft as study sites because the Maui one is a popular diving area, and so is the P-47 off Bellows. They're both well known within the diving and snorkeling communities, and so interest in them. There's interest in seeing that they are preserved and that they survive kind of where they are, so that they remain destinations for people for interested in these recreational and historical activities.
But aren't they just going to disappear? Aren't they just going to rust to nothing? I mean, I've got stuff in my garage, the tools that I bought a year ago, and they've already got corrosion because we're in a salt-rich environment. So as I said, Larry's interested in your dissertation, but let's talk about corrosion a bit.
Yeah.
And we're going to jump ahead to slide 29 because actually, let's go to slide 28. Thanks, and look at some of the collection. of of data on the surfaces. And one more slide, please. And you do this with very detailed measurements beyond just photography. And a lot of this is kind of the ecology of aircraft wrecks and what happens to them in terms of corrosion. Go ahead, Don.
Yeah, so this is our project that we've been working on for the last couple years in Hawaii, and we were fortunately enough to get out there this past April and August to go collect some samples from the wrecks. And specifically, what we're interested in is seeing, is there any kind of contribution from the ecology, and specifically the microorganisms? Do the bacteria and other microbes that colonize the surfaces of these planes, are they contributing to the corrosion? Because aluminum is very anti-corrosive. It's a popular material to use in marine engineering, especially because it doesn't corrode in the same way that something like iron would, right? And so if we still see this corrosion on wrecks, that means there's probably multiple processes going into place. It's not just simply being exposed to seawater, which will, just simply exposing iron to seawater, it will corrode. But what is going on? And so we decided that we're going to go look at what is growing on these wrecks. And so the past few slides you showed are just a few project photos that we took while we are actually collecting the microbial growth from the surfaces of these wrecks. We choose locations based off of the presence of corrosion versus non-corrosion. You see here us working in Maui on the left, working in Oahu on the right. And then we take those microbial samples and we ship them back to North Carolina, where I'm based out of. And we'll do DNA work on it, where we try to identify what is growing on the wreck based through DNA sequencing. And then that can give us an idea of, okay, so we know these microbes are here on the corroded parts. Perhaps they are the ones being responsible for this. And eventually way down the line, maybe you come up with solutions, but before you figure out how, you got to figure out the who in this equation.
So let's go to slide 25, because this is really intriguing to me. Slide 25, which should be a bunch of airplanes being built during World War II, mostly of aluminum, as you said, which is corrosion resistant. Let's say I drop this lead B-25, I think it is, gently lowered it into the waters off Oahu to be right next to the Corsair. So there's no paint on it, and it's corrosion resistant because it's aluminum.
Yeah, that's
why does it corrode then? Well, if it's corrode, what is it? Is it the biomatter that contributes to it, or why doesn't it just stay a sparkly new B-25 without crashing, if it doesn't crash, and doesn't have oil and contaminants and all of gasoline?
Yeah, so to answer your question is that it's a very complicated situation, because an aircraft is a very complicated machine. It's made up of many parts, and being anti-corrosive doesn't mean corrosive immune. And so when you do submerge, if we were to take the aircraft and we were to submerge it in a marine environment like the one off Maui or off of Oahu, it'll form a natural kind of layer around it through the chemical reactions with the seawater. But that layer, isn't 100% covered. And so there's ways for the salt and water to mix with the aluminum and corrode it in the same way that you see that with iron and seawater. But then also you have these microbes whose activities with, their respiration, their breathing, their eating, and those will produce substances that can offset that protective layer that naturally forms. and that could cause some of this corrosion that we're viewing. But really the more germane answer is that we don't know. It's kind of a new study. These are our first aluminum objects that we put in the water, right? We have centuries of data on what happens when iron wrecks go into the water, and then when iron artifacts on ships that were made of wood before that. But we don't have any.
This is new data. And by the way, I've got to prove that our viewers are paying attention, because both Larry and Charles Gilman have pointed out that yes, those are B-24s. I should have known that, but I only saw the 2 engines in the lead airplane. I didn't see the third one because we have different stuff on our screen. So I plead not guilty to failing aircraft recognition. But it is new stuff, and if we look at some shipwrecks like on slide 24, I mean, the Titanic, in this case, U-boat, there's the Titanic on the previous slide. That's probably been more studied maybe than any underwater artifact.
Yeah, I'd agree.
But it's not the same.
Yeah, so the Titanic was really the first wreck that kind of got the interest into microbial corrosion of underwater archaeology. And in the early 2000s came a report that these kind of rustical formations that you see eventually going to lead the ship to completely corrode within 200 to 400 years, and that the Titanic would be lost. And there's been some pushback on those findings by analyzing those rusticles, by looking at what is growing on it. But then that started this whole shipwreck ecology, microbial corrosion field of study within archaeology. And that U-boat and landing craft that you saw are recent studies.
In the next slide, please. Yep.
Yeah, those are recent studies done by other archaeologists who looked at what microbes are growing on and near wrecks, and how are those contributing to the corrosion of iron. I saw in the chat that that aluminum does corrode aluminum oxide. Yes, that is that passive layer that forms around the aluminum submerged object, but it does not corrode in the same way that iron, when iron forms that rust. So it doesn't form a rust in the same way that iron shipwrecks would.
Let's go to slide 29 so I can give a viewer caution. Don't get into a corrosion debate with Dom, because he knows a lot. Sorry, where's my corrosion? Types of corrosion slide, that one. We have one that shows it. There you go. So Dom knows rust.
Yeah, so this is just your basic spectrum of different types of corrosions that you'll see. And then I've got some images from a aircraft in Saipan that you see that there is corrosion going on. Some of the iron components, like the engine and stuff, those are going to corrode more and be more susceptible to marine growth, like corals, sponges, and fans. Aluminum is biologically inert. It's a toxic to a lot of marine life. So there tends to be less growth on wrecks, but there will be in areas where there's a high iron presence.
So let's talk about the ecology of it. Is there an ecological issue to all these airplanes scattered around, or are they metaphorically and practically a drop in the bucket?
Yeah, I would say that there is an artificial reef effect. I know that my experiences in Maui, that we would be in Malaya Bay. It's a very sandy seafloor, so there's not a lot of reef where we were diving. And then you'd get to this wreck and it'd be almost like a little oasis. And you'd have schools of fish. You would have crabs and shrimp. Funny story, I was collecting a sediment sample from the Helldiver I reached my hand into what was the cockpit area to scoop up a little bit of sand to do the DNA test, and I was bitten by an eel right on the hand.
Ow.
And, yeah, so there's a good amount of life just associated with these, and there could be issues of fuel leakages, but it's nowhere near the same as something like the USS Arizona, right? Which is
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, the volumetrics there are at least an order of magnitude different. So I'm a longtime aviator. I think I can ask this question with due respect for the departed, but it's not difficult to imagine a skeleton sitting at the controls of a P-47 or a Corsair or any other plane. Is that just our imagination? Does that not happen, or do the human remains disappear earlier than the aircraft remains?
It'll probably depend. It will depend on the physical environment that they are in. Warm, oxygenated waters like we have in the Pacific generally are not great preservatives of organic materials. There's lots of microbes that will go and basically dissolve skeletal matter. Within the U.S., obviously, there's a concerted effort to recover the remains. So as soon as the U.S. serviceman is discovered, often their remains will be repatriated in their hometown or somewhere more appropriate. So
but I think you're saying there's not much to recover. They may recover DNA evidence, if you will, but not.
Yeah, now 80 years later, after a lot of it, but if you found a recently discovered plane that no one else had found, no one else had tampered with, there would be no reason to believe you couldn't find, especially again, and I don't mean to talk about this in any morbid or crass terms.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of the tapestry of these aviation wrecks.
Yeah, is that the skull tends to preserve the best, or
the longest.
Yeah, or body parts that are in leather, kind of like gloves, feet.
Ah, right.
Things like that will act as a extra layer of preservation. So that's probably
so the true story. When I got to pilot training at Columbus Air Force Base, Mississippi, in December 1974, that's a long time ago, people. One of the first things they do is take your footprints, like a baby, and it's kind of intriguing. The notion was that your feet are wrapped in leather and pretty well protected, and should the worst thing happen, that will give an additional means of identifying your remains. And it's morbid, but we're talking about crashes of airplanes flown by people, and the human story is important, Dom, and I know you have a lot of appreciation for that. And we hope to talk to people from DPAA, the U.S. agency that does this, but it's a real part of the story, and I know one you respect a lot.
Yeah, I would say it is that kind of personal connection. Even, I think it's important to point out that even if there's not a loss of life associated with the wreck, you still have these very traumatic incidents. And I think about the P-47 off Bellows. Yeah. That occurred on June 21st, 1944. We know the pilot was Lieutenant William H. Sparks, who was from Miami. He's 27 years old, and he experiences engine failure not more than 1,000 yards off the end of the runway, has to eject. It must have been, a very traumatic and scary incident. So these aren't artificial reefs. They weren't purposely put there. There was an aspect of life and death, and even if the pilot or other aviators are able to survive, they should still be, these sites should still be treated reverently, whether someone died or not.
Yeah, so he didn't eject. I'm going to correct the record
Okay.
because ejection seats became part of the normal equipage in jet aircraft, but he bailed out.
Mhm.
But I'll bet that was a site of great significance to Mr. Sparks after he left the service at the end of the war. And if he came back to Hawaii, because I still see a couple places when I travel that I had significant moments in aviation, and there's a lot to that. So you're absolutely right that these are significant places for people who were serving in the most difficult circumstances of our nation. So I'm going to go to the chat because we have a lot of good questions. I'm going to ask for more questions, things we haven't answered so far. But one of the simple ones from Bill in Oahu is, what's the key factor in corrosion? Is it depth of the wreck or temperature of the ocean? Or is it both? Or is it neither?
It's a bit of both, and depth really, because that controls the dissolved oxygen content, and oxygen that is the main ingredient you need for corrosion. And so the deeper you get, the better for preservation, because there's less dissolved oxygen. And so you'll see a lot of work coming out of places like Australia, where they've done amazing work with corrosion studies. And you'll see this dependent function between depth and corrosion, where ones that are at deeper, less oxygenated areas will corrode less. It hasn't been studied in terms of microbes, so we don't exactly know if, the deeper you get, are you also getting less corrosive microbes? Because a lot of the corrosive microbes really thrive in low to no oxygenated environments. So that's one of the things that we are trying to discover is these variables that play a role in the corrosion, and that'll ultimately help with the management.
It's interesting that you've got that data from Australia, because back in my Air Force life, I worked with the Australians a great deal, one of our great allies, and they have a great body of knowledge and facilities that take a hard look at aviation corrosion, not under the ocean, but during flying. It used to be called the Defense Science and Technology Office, DISTO. I don't think it is any longer. But because they flew their airplanes for a long time and didn't just go out and willy-nilly buy new airplanes, they did some amazing work studying corrosion and wear and tear, if you will, on the metals of aircraft structures. So to another question from Christian Shano, how many wrecks are there around the islands in Hawaii? I said there are about 1,400, Navy.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was going to say that's probably somewhere between 1,100, 1,400 naval planes.
Dude.
There are a few landing craft wrecks that were they're actually wrecked not as a artificial reef and sank, but actually wrecked during amphibious exercises. And I think one of the best examples is NOAA conducted a survey of World War II sites around Maui, and it gives you a really good idea of what's present. There's multiple types of aircraft and landing craft, and it's that's a study that I would point to. They've got a website through NOAA's.
So this is NOAA, NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Aeronautic or Atmospheric Administration, right? Did I get that right?
Yeah, Oceanic and Atmospheric.
Yeah. And they can go to the website and find this study?
Yeah, there's just you just type in Maui's World War II legacy, and it comes up with it was a joint venture between NOAA and UH, and I think they did a really good job of presenting a snapshot of what is Hawaii, and then specific to Maui's World War II legacy.
So I'd ask that our administrators see if they can find the link for that and put it up in the chat so everybody can access it easily. Back to that, so that's a good question. As I said, I can't, the Army is kind of forgotten. Army Air Forces, they've kind of forgotten how many airplanes they dumped into the ocean. And they didn't dump them in, they crashed, but I'm looking at the chat and I know you are too.
Mhm.
Here's one from David Peterson, a question. Somebody did ask you what grade you got in that physics class. Did you get an A? You probably did.
Physics
I
wasn't
never
my
got
best.
an A in anything. One of your best. But have you, and this sounds like somebody who got A's a lot. David, I'm watching you, man, because I was a CD student. It says, have you studied wrecks that were deeper in anaerobic microenvironments?
No, so that was one of my criterias for this research project, is that we wanted to keep it within 60 feet. And in part, that's because there are certain regulations associated with scientific diving. And it requires a certain certification to dive deeper than 60 feet to do scientific work. But also because I'm interested in wrecks that people care about, that people are visiting, that people know about. And so the Corsair off Oahu would perhaps be a good example, because you're at 110 feet. That's a deep dive. That's towards the upper or bottom limit of recreational diving. But you're very much limited on how much time you have down there. So something like the use of ROVs and AUVs, these kind of submersible vessels that you can control from up top, perhaps that would be a way to collect the samples. I know that's what they're doing in the Gulf of Mexico with some of those shipwrecks, the U-boat that we featured, that they're sending down submersibles very deep to go collect that and view that. And I think that's some really cool research that's come up recently.
Yeah, but the human connection of diving the wreck instead of you call me a romantic, but some of the comments, here's one from Olga Zakharova. Sorry if I butchered the pronunciation, but those 3D models seem to have captured so many details, incredible. And she adds, it would be amazing if those could be reproduced, fabricate them for museum exhibits. And so my follow-on question is, given the detail, you could almost certainly 3D print them. Are we printing them?
That's something that I really, thank you, Olga, for the question. I think that's something that we do want to look into, is when we have a very crisp model, is why not get it printed out and put it in somewhere like the airport or museum or the visitor center down there in Key.
Sure.
We'd
or
like
in the
to,
Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum.
or in the
Great
Pearl Harbor
place.
Aviation Museum, definitely. I have seen 3D printed wrecks. It's not that expensive of a procedure. It's mostly about getting the data, and we've gotten the data. So that is something that I've discussed with some of my project members, and maybe something we'll look into more moving forward.
Yeah, I think it'd be incredible to have a high quality 3D model. By the way, DPAA, back when they're under a different name, Joint POWMIA Accounting Office, I think was the name, really were pioneers of 3D printing. When I was a deputy commander at US PACOM, I went down there, and this is probably in 2005, and they were pioneering 3D printing for representations of the remains. Let's see what else we have. I want to make sure we get to all of the questions that were submitted before our webcast. And one of them from Christian in Colorado, I hope you're watching, Christian, and didn't just pre-bid your question, is the Yorktown wreck was recently discovered Why did it take so long? What's the dealio?
The Yorktown wreck is a very interesting story. It's long story short, it's because you're looking for a needle in a almost infinite haystack, because we're talking about the Pacific Ocean, and I believe the Yorktown, or the USS ships like the Yorktown, like the Lexington that was also recently discovered, they're at almost 10,000 feet of water. So you need a really high level technology. I know that with the Lexington, that was a Paul Allen venture. And so you have someone who can spend $100,000 plus a day running these surveys to go find it. And so I think as the sonar technology, especially, and the underwater vehicles get more accessible and more affordable, we'll be able to locate more of these wrecks. But
that doesn't make up for the size of it, the size of the ocean. And if you haven't, it's something that I think has to be experienced. I flew over the ocean many times in twin and single engine fighters, and it's bigger. It defies description how much space we're talking about, and how difficult it is to cover in sufficient detail. I went out as a search and rescue commander, and I was flying an F-15 for a guy who had ejected over the Pacific in 1982, and just flying the pattern even at 300 knots for a long time. Fortunately, we found and rescued him, but it's a big ocean. And when you're talking about the bigness in terms of surface area, and add the magnitude of the depth, it's hard to imagine.
Yeah. That's why that archival research is really important, because you got to be able to narrow it down. You can't just go blindly looking. You're not going to find anything.
Well, yeah, you can go blindly looking, but only if you have more than $100,000 a day.
Yeah.
You don't care what to do with it. Let's take a look. We're getting close to the end, folks. I hope you all have enjoyed this as much as I have. And I'm looking for anything we haven't covered. While I do that, Dom, is there anything you want to make sure we add to the discussion before we wrap this up?
I think just one of the questions that I saw repeated several times in the ones submitted beforehand was the issue of recovery versus documentation. It was asked 3 or 4 different ways. And I would say if you look at the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum, that's a good example of being able to utilize recovered aircraft. I believe the Wildcat and the Dauntless were both fished out of Lake Michigan. And so those Lake Michigan wrecks, that's about 170, 200 feet in an area that's not very popular amongst divers, and is in a freshwater environment. And so those are good candidates for recovery. It's a little bit different when you're talking about salt water because of the preservation issues, the conservation issues. And then you'd be taking something out of its context, which adds a lot to it. And so practically speaking, they recovered I believe a helldiver off the coast of Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts. And just the recovery alone cost the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers $2 million. That's nothing to say about restoration. That's nothing to say about conservation. So I would say recovery is usually, it's something that's way above my pay grade. I will never be making decisions on that. But if I had to address it, I would say that it's really matters on a case-by-case basis.
So two points on that. First of all, it didn't cost the Corps of Engineers $2 million. It cost us, the taxpayers, $2 million. I get grumpy every April 15th, so I got to make sure we know whose money it is, and it's all of us who are taxpayers. But that brings up an interesting question when you say it's above your pay grade. We've had a couple of questions about your future. What's the career path for an underwater underwater archaeologist. When you complete your PhD, dissertation, etc., and you're anointed as doctor of the undersea world, then what? What will you do? And remember that we've got, I'm sure, a lot of younger viewers who are intrigued and hopefully inspired by what you've done, but would like to know where it leads. Where will your path lead you?
Yeah, that's a great question. Something that I obviously think about a lot. You know, growing up, I always thought the only job for an archaeologist, especially underwater one, was you have to work at a university. You have to work as a professor. That's the only. But as I come up, I'd say about maybe 20% of archaeologists actually work in the academic sphere, and so a lot of jobs open up in the government and agency sphere, and so that is ideally somewhere I would like to head towards. Is we're gonna, maybe someone like NOAA, a government agency that makes these decisions on how do we manage these sites, which sites do we document. That would probably be the ideal landing place for someone like me.
Well, I hope you'll keep us posted, and the viewers and your friends here at the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum, and continue to be a part of our Ohana, because we really value not just what you do, but the way you do it, and your commitment and the humanity with which you approach the subject matter, Don. It's been great having you. I know we're about 1 minute from the end, and I'm waiting for Ashley to jump in and take control as we wrap up our thing. And by the way, there's a huge team, really a huge team. Ashley, Ford, Bill, at the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum that make this possible. So for the wrap, here you are, Ashley. I think Don was awesome.
I thought so too. I really wanted to just dig in even more. But 1 hour is not enough. You got to come back, man. We got to make a series. And I see all the enthusiasm in our chat. And thank you all for giving us your questions. And I know we couldn't get to all of them. So if you guys ask them real nicely, hopefully Don will come back and join us again. But I wanted to thank you both for joining us today. Thank you for joining us and being our moderator.
Always a pleasure,
today.
Ashley. Thanks.
We do thank you for making the time coming up. I know you're traveling now. And Don, this was so fascinating. It's so interesting. And you got us such great images to look at. I think we all walked away a little bit with more questions than when we came on. I think everybody's a little bit more interested. We're waiting for your dissertation. Obviously, we saw that. We're waiting for all the papers you're going to write, and hopefully we see you somewhere in some documentary. I'm guaranteeing somebody's going to nab you for something. You have a wealth of knowledge.
Sure.
And I look forward to watching that when it comes out. Just hint, hint, nudge, nudge to anybody's watching. There we go.
There you go. And in fact, we got somebody in the chat actually said Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum should give Dom a job, is the quote from Edmund, the former physics teacher at St. Louis. Hey, viewers, if you got a job for Dom, pony up, send a chat, drop him an email, something lucrative, I hope, because he deserves it.
Absolutely. And, we will always keep him in mind for everything. Don, please come back anytime, and anytime you are here, let us know and we will give you the deluxe tour. But thank you both for coming, and thank you all for tuning in and visiting with us today. It's really our viewers that support this kind of programming and really showing all of your interest to us. We know what you want to see, and we invite those people to speak for you, but we cannot do it without you at all.
Okay, Ashley, Jessica just answered the question. Yes, there will be a webinar, the recorded version on our YouTube channel.
Yes, please look us up on YouTube, our YouTube channel, same name as our museum, and we have all of our recorded webinars from the past year and a half. If you've missed it, go back and rewatch. There's always something cool to learn, even if you missed it, or even if you did attend the first time. But thank you all for attending. Aloha, and we will see you
Aloha.
next time. Ahui ho.